I'd like for my first open-ended question for you to share with us the story of your family coming to the United States.
So, um, luckily, my great grandfather's brother, who was the first Winkle to come to the United States, who created the Winkle name, actually, the way we spell it, and that's part of a story. But luckily, he wrote a short, what I call journal. It's about 10 or 15 pages. And because of what he wrote, I've been able to trace our family back to my great, 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 great grandfather. Um, and so I know where they lived um, in the old country, which um, the farthest back I can trace, they were in Lithuania. It is now in Russian territory where the last place they lived in that part of the world before they made their way here. The first to come to the United States was my great grandfather's brother. His name, he went by Marcus Winkle or Max Winkle, both those names. Um, and he lived um, he first came. He has a wonderful story of when he was a young man. My great great grandfather was like many people had kind of a probably a dry goods store is what I would think it would be in the old country, and he had they did all kinds of things and supplied goods, and they also rose to apparently some prominence. And so Marcus was able to travel some. He went to Palestine. His tales there were very interesting. But because of that, and being able to go to Palestine, and this is in the 1800s, he was able to borrow money on his father's name. My um, great great grandfather was his name was Yehuda Hirsch. The original name, I believe, was something like Vinikowski, something like that. Anyway, Marcus eventually, after his Palestine experience, goes back to Russia. Um, the story is that he was conscripted into the Tsar's army, and that was basically certain death. And so they said he was going to leave, and he was either going to go to the United States or to Australia, and they chose the United States. Some relatives were in Australia. Anyway, they this is a story that's at the Jewish Museum of Florida in a video that I played Marcus, my great grandfather's brother, in this video. It was, I think, the first video done at the Jewish Museum of Florida. And it was really also done as a grant for school kids to learn about minorities and sensitivity. And they focused on 4 families, the Winkle family being one. Because of Marcus's story. So anyway, Marcus and his father, Yehuda Hirsch Winkle, make their way to Constantinople. And my understanding is he gets on a ship, and eventually they get a fake passport, fake identity, and he makes his way to America. And he gets to New York, so I suspect he went through Ellis Island. And there was somebody, and he knew who to go see for at least the first night and or two, and to get a room and and a job. And there was somebody in New York City with the same last name, no relationship, but who had a very bad reputation. And so Marcus changed the last name from Winkowski to Weinkle, and he spelled it Weinkle for two reasons. One, Weinkle is kind of a Dutch name and Dutch word, and the Dutch had been good to Jews at that point in history, and certainly were through the Holocaust, as you know from the Anne Frank story. But this is the late 1800s. And the other reason he spelled it this way was so that anybody with this name would know that they were related. So because of so anyway, Marcus is in New York, and eventually the rest of the family comes over, including my great-grandfather, whose name was Louis Weinkle. His wife was Rosa. And my great-grandparents came as well, Yehuda Hirsch Weinkle and his wife, Nechama. So they all adopted the Weinkle name. And somehow they had been in timber, my understanding is, in the old country. And so they made their way to the south and were in South Carolina, and eventually in Georgia, where my grandfather was raised, somewhere near Brunswick, in a place where there was probably a rail depot. They were timbering. There's no town there anymore. What I understood from my grandfather when he was a boy, it was called Weinkle, Georgia, but it doesn't exist anymore. It's just a crossroads. But there was probably a rail depot there. And so my wing was in Georgia. Great-grandfather, Yehuda Hirsch Weinkle, who also went by the name Jerome Hirsch, or J.H. Weinkle, was also in the timber business. He was in South Carolina. He was definitely in Savannah. But Marcus comes to Florida, and in North Florida, and eventually the rest of them come, including my great-grandparents. But Marcus's tale is particularly interesting because with him, he brings what's known as a family Torah, and it's about maybe 18 inches high. And he brings it, and it is believed to be the first family Torah to come into the state of Florida.
I wanted to move on 2 years later, 1958, because you've told me previously that's the year that your family went specifically to Temple Israel.
I don't think it was 58, but it was 59 or 60, but whatever. It doesn't, somewhere around then.
So, again, of course, you were very young, but I'd like to ask what you remember about those early years of yours as a child at Temple Israel.
Yeah, so before I'll get into that, I just want to give a little shout out. So when my grandfather and grandparents and great-grandparents came to Miami, there was probably one congregation back then, and that was Beth David. And it was downtown Miami. I think it was on 3rd Street. And my great-grandfather was very learned Jew and very important to him. And he became very involved at Beth David. And when the congregation moved to Coral Way much later, I don't know if the sanctuary is still there, but because the big portico is gone now, but on the bima, there was a plaque for my grandfather, Louis Weinkle. So that always meant a lot. But the family was at Beth David for generations, and many of my cousins were there until probably the last 10 years. It's a wonderful place. And and but my family came. There was a wonderful rabbi in the 50s who, his name was Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and no, not Greenberg, Rosenberg, I believe. And I met him in Israel decades later. A funny story, but anyway, he had left, and he became, I believe, a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative seminary. I don't know if that's when he went there, but eventually he did. But he left Beth David, and my parents really respected and appreciated him. And whoever was the next rabbi, I don't think was really to their taste or whatever. But my grandparents left Beth David, and my parents left. And my parents went to Temple Israel, and my grandparents had probably already left and were among the founders of Temple Emmanuel on the beach, where my grandmother was till her death, and she loved Rabbi Lehrman there. But my parents came to Temple Israel, and so I was probably 4 years old. I remember my earliest memories of Temple Israel are either kindergarten or first grade with Joan Bornstein. So my history with Joan, who was just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful woman, as was her husband, Cantor Bornstein, a wonderful man. But my earliest memories of Temple Israel are being in her classroom. I could describe for you the books we read. They were on little holidays, and they were and Joan would tell me a story, how she kept for decades and decades a picture I drew for her when I was in her class in kindergarten, and that always moved me greatly. But I went, as did my siblings, all but one of us. The oldest brother his bar mitzvah was at Beth David. My oldest sister, in those days, women did not have, at least in conservative movement, I guess she was confirmed at Temple Israel, but she didn't have a bat mitzvah. But the rest of us, the bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvah took place at Temple Israel. But we were always prepared for our bar mitzvah. I had Hebrew with Joan, and I would go to the University of Miami in those days and ride my bike for my Hebrew class with her. But we were really prepared by a man at Beth David we always knew as Mar Gayton. And he trained all of us for our bar mitzvah, including my youngest sister. So we always had a Beth David connection for that. But that's how the Weinkles came to Temple Israel. And then my dad was at some point on the board, and I was on the board for many years as well.
That's great. I actually want to get to that in just a moment. But first, just again with the Jewish geography, my mother came down many years ago, and I had a yahrzeit plate put in for her father. And on that particular trip, an Oneg Shabbat, one of my favorite examples of Jewish geography was also with Joan Bornstein. And I'm sure you're aware that Joan was a camp counselor at Camp Louise, where I'm from in Maryland, for decades. Well, it turned out when we did the dedication for that yahrzeit plate, my mother and Joan had not been in such close proximity since the early mid-1950s, when Joan was her counselor at Camp Louise.
Wow.
So it's so fun to see these things pieced together this way. Life. We've all seen ups and downs at Temple Israel, and you took a year from your life to serve as executive director. And I love the temple. I can't imagine doing that. And I just want anything you could share with us about that decision. That was just such a sacrifice and a service.
It was actually a bit more than a year. It was probably a year and a half. But I had been on the board. The temple was in deficits, which I didn't understand why we could be in deficits, but that's been throughout most of the history. And the then executive director, we were going to do the renovation. The temple was going to do the renovation, which was restoring the sanctuary to the way you see it now. Not everything was actually completed the way it should have been, but the center aisle was put in. The steps up to the bema on the front was done. The burgundy carpet that you see in places was put in. And that was done so that there could be weddings. Asbestos was taken out of all the structures. The colors actually in the sanctuary were picked out by a couple of us, and we had a wonderful architect at that point who really had a vision, and so it really enhanced the beauty and awesomeness of the sanctuary. And during my tenure as executive director, it was dedicated to honor Bertha Abbas, who had been such a wonderful, the Abbas family has been a wonderful part of Temple Israel, of course. And really on her deathbed, we got it done before she passed away, and hooked her up. It was hooked her up to, it was before videos, but we were able to get her the feed, and while she couldn't be there, there were members of the family there. But anyway, to your specific question, the renovation was going to take place, and Alan Heilig, who was then the executive director, decided he was going to step down as executive director, but he wanted to be the construction manager. And Michael Silver was going to be the incoming president, but Stanley Tate was still president. And Stanley is a great force, as everyone knows, and was, and steered a lot of this forward. And a lot of this, I don't think would have happened but for Stanley's force and presence, and of course the generosity of a tremendous amount of people at the time. And but anyway, I was at a point in I'm a lawyer, and I was at a point in my law practice where I needed to make some changes, and I had already thought about becoming a rabbi. I had gone to Israel and studied for 6 months in Hebrew, and there were a lot of reasons I chose not to be a rabbi, but I definitely had a calling for it. And so there was going to be this need for an executive director, and they had begun a search, and I thought about it and said, I can do this job. I've never exactly run an organization like this, but how bad can I be? Because this place was in deficits. Members were leaving. They were very unhappy. And I had a personality where I could make friends with people and calm energy and seeing life as more positive than negative. And I thought, from my position as a board member and being very involved in many ways, that would be helpful. And I approached Stanley after giving it some thought and said, Stanley, I know someone who would be a great executive director. I think it would be out of the ordinary, but I think it would be an interesting pick. And he said, who? And I said, I need to meet with you. I'm not going to tell you. And this was first on the phone. He goes, I'm not meeting with you unless you tell me. And I and I stalled a little bit, but eventually I said, me. And he said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "Probably." And he said, "Okay, well, come over to my office tomorrow." And we met, and he goes, "I think you're nuts." And he said, "But I think this could be a really great thing for the temple." And, and I just, I felt I knew what my strengths were. The temple had a lot of problems. I think I had the intellect and the creativity to handle all those things. I knew what my challenges were. And so I have always in my life, for the most part, had the wherewithal to confront my challenges head on, by preparing, studying, whatever. Um, and and so there was a little bit of a transition, where I became like the associate executive director for a month or two, and then I became executive director. But there were wonderful staff members like the late Edith Kerness, um, um, and Marilyn Dix, who were there for a long time. Brandy Premack was the rabbi secretary. And those three women and the maintenance crew were particularly became very supportive, as did the congregation and the sisterhood, and eventually those who were not so happy about my presence realized I wasn't an idiot and I could do the job, and I was serious, and I did. And within that year and a quarter, I made some very tough decisions, but balanced the budget. But during that time, it was really important to me also to do some substantial reforms. And with a good committee of members, including Norma Orovitz and some folks who aren't around anymore, I rewrote the bylaws and redefined family. And we were the first congregation in the United States, because of me, and I take great pride in this, to redefine family as people in a committed relationship. And that opened the door, quite frankly, to gay and lesbian families, which have become a very important part of Temple Israel. There were three great rabbis in Miami. It was always the lore. And they were Rabbi Neret, Rabbi Lehrman at Emmanuel, and Rabbi Kronish at Beth Shalom. And those were the triumvirate in many ways. There were other wonderful rabbis, and that's not taking away from any other congregation, but those three were particularly well known. And Rabbi Neret had already made Temple Israel, a progressive place. And it was, Joan Bornstein would tell you, when Head Start was created in as part of the Great Society by Lyndon Johnson, one of the projects of before it became a national program was at Temple Israel, from what I understand. The anti-war movement in the 60s, Rabbi Neret joined with my oldest brother and other people with a moratorium against the war down US 1. I remember making banners as a kid and signs. But Temple Israel was a welcoming place already. When Anita Bryant did her thing, and Ruth Shack had sponsored, when she was a commissioner, had sponsored a anti-discrimination clause against gay people, and that was part of the county commission agenda, and it became an ordinance. But Anita Bryant, and this is 1973 or 77, pardon, but fought against it and they repealed it.
Yeah.
But Temple Israel was one of the places that stood up for the gay community. So there was a history there, but there were only a few gay congregations, and that was never my intent for Temple Israel to be a gay congregation. I always wanted to follow Temple Israel's history of being a progressive, welcoming congregation to everybody, to especially people in interfaith families, and there were Christians who wanted to join us, and I felt really very important. That was very important that they had a place here, especially when they were part of an interfaith family. Same for gay people, same for African American people and Asian people. It was very important to me that this be a welcoming place, and that our bylaws say that. So that was part of that. And Norma Orovitz was on that committee, as well as I forget his first name, but Mr. Shear, and I knew his children well. But anyway, those were all wonderful parts of my executive director. We were down to very little space during those times, because of all the renovations, and we would do dinners. I did no cost budget, no cost kind of social events, and we would do things in people's house, or we would do outings to the symphony and the arts, and there were wonderful people who got involved in this. It was a good point in my life. As far as the congregation, there were certain challenges.
Talk to us about the creative things that you did.
You want me to open this now?
Yes. I sent this to you as a secret to open a conversation about your creativity. You know, I hope that the background screen doesn't interfere with your showing us what you've got. It looks like it won't. It looks like it'll be okay. Oh, wait. Maybe not. Are you able to turn off the?
No, I don't want to, because there's a reason I have it on.
Okay. I think if you hold it up close to the screen, we'll see it. And you'll, of course, tell us what it is.
Can you see that?
See George Burns' hairline, but
oh, so this is a movie poster for Oh God. I know why you're doing this. Okay. So, okay. So that has to do with my teaching.
By the way, we couldn't see it very well. That's a movie poster from the movie Oh God that George Burns did, and I believe he did a sequel, several during the 1980s.
Yeah, there was one sequel, but so I kind of I kind of need to talk about how I came to Temple Israel as an adult, because that leads into my creativity and being what I used to call the radical of Temple Israel. I began writing a Haggadah and cranked out one that was different before that first Passover. And the second year this happened, I let the then assistant rabbi of Temple Israel, the first woman rabbi actually at Temple Israel, Ariel Stone was her name, who we became very close friends. And I let Ariel read it, and she goes, and I remember her reading it, and she said, "There's something really missing here." And I said, "What?" And she goes, "You know what it is." I said, she goes, "Think about it. What's missing?" I said, "Me." And she goes, "Exactly." She goes, "You know, you've compromised yourself here. And why? You've gone to this extent to interpret things, but you're not writing what's in your heart." And so I did a major rewrite. And where I began writing the prayers and rewriting prayers and trying to give homage to the tradition, but reflecting upon them both in particularly in English, because my Hebrew wasn't much, but really writing new ways of interpretation and the spiritual essence of some of that which we do. And that led to Rex had opened the door to some creative services. On Saturday morning, the study group is named Joseph's Table. I met Joe and Esther Grossbart. I guess after my 5th year practicing law, so that was 1992 or 3, my grandfather had died. I went off to Israel with Rex's encouragement, and Dana Magat was an assistant rabbi at the time, and Ariel, I had talked with all of them. Mitch Shevitz was not anything affiliated with Temple Israel, but I went to visit Mitch and talked to other rabbis about me becoming a rabbi. Because I had done so much creative writing and prayers at this point, and I had a voice which, in people like Rex's mind at the time, was needed in Reform Judaism. I wrote a interpretation reflection on the Shema that Norma Orovitz will tell you about.
Excuse me, James, your students have told me about it.
But there were other prayers, and they were recognizing which couldn't really be recognized, and that was my theology, which was that we are God. We're not just praying to God, but we are God. To me, the Shema talks about oneness. We have to be part of that oneness. So therefore we are God. And when all is God, then you have respect for everybody. And nothing can be different. And evil is also part of that all. And so you have to learn to deal with evil. And I don't get into this Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov and all this kind of stuff. My mind doesn't work in those complicated fashions. No criticism of anybody, but my mind is very simple in some ways and very complex in others. But all of this became part of what I was writing and creating. And so eventually I mentioned the Grossbarts because I had come back from Israel and decided I wasn't going to go to rabbinical school for a number of reasons. But I remember coming back to the temple, and Rex did a service, and it was the night I met the Grossbarts, and he did a service. It was in the Round. It was in Wolfson Auditorium, and they did something pre-recorded for the radio, and because that was always a hindrance of doing certain things. But it was an interpretation of the prayer, or God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And in those days, they didn't talk about the women, but Rex's theme that night was on that prayer and the whole experience kind of centered around that, was that each generation, and this is really what that prayer means, but each generation has its own relationship with God. And what is God to you? And that night, I heard Esther Grossbart speak as a Holocaust survivor of losing her children or son in the Holocaust. And that was the night I became to me, a very dear friend of hers. And the night, the day of her funeral, which was my birthday, I had the opportunity to speak at her funeral. But those kind of things led me to become creative, and I would write new services and creative Shabbat services, and and Temple Israel provided a place for me to do that and to honor a traditional Shabbat. And in so many ways, I compromised and fitted into the rubric that I otherwise wouldn't have done. But people opened their minds and hearts to me. There was pushback at times. It wasn't always comfortable, but there were rabbis like Mitch who later opened the experience, which became I used to call it my hour of power. But after the morning Yom Kippur service, I had an hour to do something creative. And that eventually, I did some pretty wild things and would come in my Indian clothing and my hair long and flowing and bring in prayer bells and open people's hearts and minds to something different, bringing in Buddhist thought and Hindu thought, and eventually the Amen services that I created, which were Amen stood for at 1 minute, alternative at 1 minute, because if you look at the word atonement, I would break it into the words at 1 minute. And so to me, these holidays should really be about oneness and stuff. So I would do incredibly creative things and brought in for the first time chanting at Temple Israel with kirtan chanting and Judicized it. And these I remember the first experience, they set up a room. They put 18 chairs in there thinking I'd get maybe 5 people. And there were hundreds. And every year it grew. So I've always felt there was a need for that, a need for differentness at Temple Israel, for it to be stronger. And I respected the traditional Friday night service, but I just have always felt it can be so much more if you embrace where people are.
Wonderful. So this is the larger context in which working with kids and teaching them, you took them to see God in the movie theater.
No, I didn't. So, no, what I did was, Rabbi Dana Magat was the assistant rabbi during, near the end of Rex's tenure. I think he may have been the last assistant under Rex. I don't remember. He's in California now, but Dana was the education director, and he was a fine educator. But Dana asked me to be the 7th grade teacher, and I foolishly said yes. I had already taught confirmation, and the 9th and 10th grade were amazing. And some of those kids in 9th and 10th grade, I've later officiated at their weddings. That's how close we were. And I still see some of those and get Facebook messages from 2 in particular who are very much part of my life all these years later. But Dana asked me to teach 7th grade, and I, opened it up to where it was in the round, and I had, 12 kids in that class, and I'm not a professional teacher, I'm a lawyer, and I, opened my heart to them, as I had done with the confirmation kids, because we did amazing things with the confirmation kids, but they were mature enough for it. And I designed this curriculum of exposing them to different aspects of Jewish thought and what have you. And Rabbi David Magat had approved that curriculum, and it was so far above their heads and interest that within 2 sessions it was out of control. And I went to Dana and I just said, you need a babysitter with this group. You don't need me. And I don't have time. I don't have time to waste with this. And he said, what do you want? He said, let's go over what you want to teach. And I said, well, I'm throwing this curriculum out. It's gone. And so I began to teach them through what I called Sunday at the movies. And at times the sixth grade teacher who became a good friend, she would bring her sixth graders and we would watch movies, but I would stop them and teach along the way. And so, Oh God, with George Burns, which I think was an amazing movie when it came out, was one of the first movies I showed. And we talked about, and I was able to teach about what God is. What do we see God as? And that's one of the messages of that brilliant movie that Carl Reiner had produced or directed, maybe wrote. And George Burns did a masterful job playing God in it. And those kids, when I turned it on for them, it was such an old movie. And it was a somewhat contemporary. I forgot how old the movie was at that point, but it was it ended up being a wonderful way for them to learn. And some of those kids, I didn't do any of their weddings, but they all stayed in touch with me for years. And there was one young man whose parents had separated and divorced, and in a very friendly way, but the father came out as gay and had a partner, and it was the mother was very accepting of it, and as was the young man, but he came to me with literal things from the Bible and questioning, while he loved his father, these struggles. And these were struggles I had. But I began to teach him privately on that with his, both of his parents' blessings, and looking at these words and what do they really mean and what is it saying, and isn't your father's relationship with his partner beautiful and loving, and when we began to teach and explore in those ways, and those experiences were very much part of my teaching.